it flourished and how it declined. And I love this series. The flaws of these games are abundant and sometimes surprisingly consistent, but within them are so many highs, so much innovation, and so much originality that I do wholeheartedly believe that not only is Final Fantasy worthy of being considered as one of the greatest series in gaming, but that it might even be deserving of more praise than it already receives. This video is an entire series retrospective, covering all 16 mainline entries. I have played most of these games multiple times. Some of them I have played 4 or 5 times. One of these games I have played for somewhat more than that, but most importantly, I have recently played each of these games consecutively over the last 2 months. And while a lot of people have talked about this series already, I don't think many people have ever played all of these games back to back over such a short time frame. So it may come as no surprise then that I have a lot to say about Final Fantasy, particularly how the series has changed, what each game manages to accomplish, and what was lost or sacrificed along the long and still ongoing 36-year journey this series spans. This video will mostly avoid spoilers, but there is some discussion of plot points, so if you want a completely unspoiled and blind experience for any of these games, you may want to skip over those parts of the videos. Also, I do occasionally get noticeably vague about certain plot points, but that's because I'm trying to avoid spoiling things. Anyway, on to the 80s. There is an oft-told story about how Final Fantasy was created that frames it as a last-ditch effort of a struggling company who put all their hopes, dreams, and remaining money on this one final game. Hence the name. Unfortunately, as poetic as this telling of events might be, it's not entirely truthful. Square was a Japanese software developer established in 1983 who created a number of early PC and Famicom titles spanning a diverse range of genres. One of the company's early hires was a young programmer and university student by the name of Hironobu Sakaguchi, whose work and work ethics impressed those in the company, leading him to become one of their 4 project leads in 1986, the same year that a certain landmark RPG from developer Enix first released. Dragon Quest took inspiration from a number of PC games, particularly the Western RPG series Wizardry and Ultima, to create a more accessible and console-focused take on the genre. In doing so, Dragon Quest helped to create the Japanese console role-playing genre, more commonly referred to as the JRPG. As a result of its daring and innovation, Dragon Quest saw slow initial sales from an audience unsure what to make of this new type of game. But in time, its sales picked up, and then exploded, with 1.5 million copies being sold in Japan alone, making it one of the highest-selling Famicom games not published by Nintendo. Meanwhile, Sakaguchi, who was also a fan of Wizardry and Ultima, used the success of Dragon Quest to persuade Square to greenlight an RPG of their own that he would take the lead on. Despite this, Square remained skeptical of the project and limited its development team to initially just 5 people. And yet for Sakaguchi, this was finally an opportunity to work on the genre he most wanted to, where he could focus on the aspect of game design he was most passionate about: storytelling. And 1 year later, in December of 1987, Final Fantasy was released. For Sakaguchi, this may well have been his final game, as he made preparations to quit game development and return to university in the event that the game was a failure. But this wasn't how the series came to be named. In fact, the original title was meant to be Fighting Fantasy, which was only changed due to copyright concerns, with Final being chosen as a replacement, primarily because Sakaguchi wanted to maintain the abbreviated name of FF. Meanwhile, for Square, the success of Final Fantasy would forever change the company's trajectory, and they were experiencing severe financial difficulties at the time of its release. Yet whether Final Fantasy ever had the potential to be Square's final game remains unclear, and it wasn't their only commercial success of the year. Still, in the end, Final Fantasy was far from a failure, and came to represent more of a beginning than an ending for Sakaguchi and Square both. Final Fantasy begins with a short text crawl explaining that the world is in peril and that a prophecy has foretold of the arrival of 4 warriors. This leads directly into character creation, where you create your party of 4. Once the game begins in earnest, you find yourself in the town of Corneria, where you're soon tasked with rescuing a princess from the Night Garland at the Temple of Fiends to the north. This is only the beginning of your grand adventure, but it is indicative of the level of storytelling found in Final Fantasy's first entry. The game's various NPCs do provide a little more detail and help explain the problems each town is experiencing, yet the primary purpose of an NPC in Final Fantasy I is not to enhance the narrative, but rather to provide the player with hints and reminders of where to go and what to do. For a console game of this era, this still presented more story than most games had, but the main reason for this narrative brevity was mostly the data limitations of NES games at the time, which limited the amount of text that could be stored on a game's cartridge. This was one of the largest problems early JRPGs faced, and was a major contributor for the streamlined approach pioneered by Dragon Quest that ended up setting Japanese RPGs on a different path from their Western inspirations. Final Fantasy I was a more complicated game than the first Dragon Quest, however, with a significantly longer runtime, party members and multiple enemies instead of 1v1 fights, and more spells, equipment, and items. As a result of this complexity, combined with the NES's technical limitations, Final Fantasy I put a lot of important information in its manual. Manuals were important to many older games, in a way that younger generations may not realize. Forget floppy disks and VHS tapes, kids don't really need to know what they were, but the same cannot be said about manuals, as they were often a part of the intended experience and provided incredibly helpful information, as Final Fantasy I demonstrates. This manual is over 80 pages long, and provides a complete tutorial of all the game's important mechanics, from creating your party to fighting enemies, saving the game, navigating menus, and much more. Still, it also provides crucial tips that even experienced JRPG players might overlook, like buy potions and run away from dangerous encounters, as well as a complete world map, an enemy chart including enemy stats, weaknesses, and special attacks, explanations of what each spell does, something not told to players in-game, statistics for each piece of equipment, something else not displayed in-game, dungeon maps for the game's first 4 dungeons, and finally, a complete walkthrough for the entire first half of the game, right up to getting the airship. This is a lot of information, perhaps even too much, as this is the manual created for the American release, which is noticeably twice the length of the Japanese one, and really went above and beyond with providing players with as much helpful information as possible. This is because in the late 80s, console players weren't used to games like this, or games with an equivalent amount of complexity, and Final Fantasy I clearly wanted to be an accessible experience that could be enjoyed by players new to the RPG genre. And for the most part, it succeeded, even if its over-reliance on its manual is far from ideal. I feel a little bad for any 80s or early 90s kids who lost some of these inserts, or maybe borrowed this game from a friend and had to play it without knowing things like what each spell does, or how much attack each weapon has. Still, for as much as Final Fantasy I wants to be accessible and tries to help players, make no mistake, this is not an easy game. Combat in Final Fantasy I is turn-based, with random encounters found on the overworld and in dungeons. And right outside the very first town, you can run into monsters who can one-shot your party members. Also, monsters in this game like to travel in packs, have a fondness for inflicting status effects, and sometimes ambush you. This combination can be particularly deadly, and the world of Final Fantasy I feels dangerous, far more so than in later games in the series. This is mostly because you can only save the game at an inn, or with an expensive tent on the overworld. Healing is also limited as spells have limited charges, and for much of the game you won't have enough money to buy all the spells and equipment you want, limiting your supply of gold and, by extension, restorative items. This means that with every step you take further away from the safety of the inn, danger increases, healing and hit points diminish, and the tension gradually ramps up as dying becomes more and more likely, at the same time that the loss of progress from death becomes more and more costly. One of the most important lessons players can learn in this game is knowing when to turn around so you can make it back safely to the inn before disaster. The other vital lesson players must learn is the importance of the run option. Some combat encounters are too dangerous, or simply take too many resources to overcome, meaning fleeing is the best option. This goes against the convention of modern game design, where the option to flee exists for the player's convenience, and enemy encounters are deliberately designed to be an appropriate and beatable difficulty. Meanwhile, in Final Fantasy I, encounter difficulty is more varied, and some combinations are meant to be overly difficult, with fleeing existing to provide a necessary strategic option. And when you've gained the wisdom to know when to turn back and the humility to know to run, then, and only then, are you ready for Marsh Cave, aka the hardest dungeon in the game and one of the hardest in the entire 16-game series. Marsh Cave is the first dungeon in the game, if that wasn't clear, and while it takes a while to get here, this is where the difficulty of the game peaks. Final Fantasy I basically has an inverse difficulty curve, where you struggle a lot and feel weak early on, and then grow in power at a faster rate than your enemies do, making you feel very powerful later in the game. This can be quite satisfying, provided you make it through Marsh Cave, aka the hardest dungeon in the game. There are people who will tell you that Final Fantasy I is a game where you are meant to grind. And these people aren't wrong, but they aren't entirely correct either. Final Fantasy I is a game where you can, and many people do, grind. This allows you to bypass much of the risk inherent in the game's rather punishing design by killing monsters in the relative safety that comes with staying close to a town where you're never far from the ability to save and heal, and then only heading to the next dungeon when you feel sufficiently prepared and powerful. Still, there is an alternative to this, which feels more like the way the game is intended to be played, where you head off to your objective, whatever that may be, and then turn back when you first start to run low on resources. In doing this, you'll still gain experience points, like when grinding, while also learning the ins and outs of dungeons, memorizing the floor layouts, picking up treasure from side paths, and gaining familiarity with the enemies you encounter so you know things like when to run or when to use your limited AoE spells. For a ball-bustingly difficult dungeon like Marsh Cave, where your resources are pitifully limited and you can't even use magic yet to quickly teleport to a dungeon's exit, you'll probably have to run back many times before clearing the dungeon, and the risk is so high that you may just be better off killing enemies outside of town, at least to get you started. For the remaining dungeons in the game though, grinding near a town usually feels like a slower, less efficient, and less enjoyable way to play. Attempting dungeons without grinding allows your limited resources to act as a natural difficulty check, where if you're strong enough, you'll make quick progress, and if you're not, the repeated trips back to town will lead you to naturally acquiring more golden experience points until you are. This structure of reaching a town, struggling to overcome the next dungeon, before eventually beating it, leading to the next town and the next dungeon where there's better equipment and more powerful enemies, shows the heart of what Final Fantasy I is really like, and reveals an important fact that isn't often acknowledged, which is that Final Fantasy I is basically a dungeon crawler. It might not resemble more modern examples, And it doesn't take long for the Final Fantasy series to move away from this, but dungeons are the main focus of this game. They are where you spend the vast majority of your time, they are why there is such a large emphasis on resource management, and they are why this game is still enjoyable 36 years later. And Final Fantasy I, the NES version, is still enjoyable. Unlike so many JRPGs, including most of the Final Fantasy series, and especially some of its best entries, in Final Fantasy I, normal combat encounters are strategically engaging. This is largely because you can't just spam auto attacks to overcome every basic encounter, as Final Fantasy I lacks auto-targeting. This means that if you tell all your party members to attack one enemy, and the first party member kills them, then the next 3 party members will waste their turns doing nothing rather than automatically targeting the next available enemy. And if your party members waste their turn, you will kill enemies more slowly, meaning enemies get more opportunities to attack you, causing you to run out of resources faster and have to retreat back to town. Therefore, it becomes crucial to spread your attacks out while trying to understand how many hit points each enemy has and how much damage you're likely to do, so you can do this as efficiently as possible. There is an element of risk and reward to this too. If you fail to kill an enemy because you didn't assign enough people to attack them, they will survive and get to attack you, but assign too many people and you waste characters' turns through overkill, and so you're forced to think carefully about who you tell your characters to attack, even in basic encounters. The combination of managing auto-attacks, using your limited spells at key moments, knowing when to turn back or flee, and prioritizing dangerous or low-health enemies all comes together to make an engaging and enjoyable combat system, where the more you understand your enemies, the better you'll do, and where every combat encounter feels meaningful as your limited resources ensure you want to prevent as much damage as possible. I'm not going to say Final Fantasy I has the best combat in the series, because it doesn't, but it is one of the more strategic games in the series, and for a game from 1987, it might surprise you. Still, being such an old game, from a time where the genre was still young, it also has its share of problems, and some are significant. Like the prevalence of bugs, which is not too surprising considering the game's age, but several spells simply don't work, and the intelligence stat is bugged so it doesn't affect spell damage, making magic less impactful the further into the game you get. This leads on to another problem, which is class balance. Final Fantasy allows you to create your own party out of 6 different classes, and this helps create strong replayability and is one of the game's most unique features. However, magic users, and particularly the Black Mage, feel rather weak, and for physical damage dealers, the Fighter is far superior to the Thief and Monk, and as there are no unique class abilities, this means there's little reason to take a Thief or Monk. Fighters are expensive to buy equipment for, so there is at least one downside to them, but overall, the high imbalance is quite noticeable and a bit disappointing. And when it comes to balance, certain ambushes can feel downright unfair, with enemies capable of inflicting one-hit KO style status effects before you even get a chance to act. And as it may be a long time since you've last saved, this can be pretty frustrating. Still, the biggest problem Final Fantasy I has might just be that it's rather slow. From the combat, which can have a lot of enemies and a lot of individually appearing text boxes describing every action, to the sedate walk speed of your character, or certain annoying design choices like having to buy and use potions individually, which ends up being a surprisingly substantial time sink. Final Fantasy I is just not a fast-paced game, and it's here it shows its age more so than in its actual game design. In other ways though, Final Fantasy was ahead of the curve, and if it looks old by today's standards, it certainly didn't at its time of release. JRPGs which came before Final Fantasy, like Dragon Quest, Digital Devil Story, Megami Tensei, and Phantasy Star, all featured front-on first-person combat screens showing only your enemy. Final Fantasy, however, was the first game to use a side-on perspective, showing not only a vast array of detailed enemy sprites, but also the player's characters, who had animations for attacks and spells, and altered appearances to reflect being injured, suffering from status effects, or being knocked unconscious. This, in many ways, marked the beginning of the Final Fantasy series' heavy emphasis on presentation, and its long-running desire to one-up its competition in visuals. And compared to other RPGs of its time, Final Fantasy's side-on view does make it seem more visually engaging. Another thing that began here was many of the series' most iconic pieces of music. From the instantly recognizable Victory fanfare to the calm, inviting prelude, or the still heavily used series main theme. Long-running and widely celebrated series composer Nobuo Uematsu's soundtrack did much to bring Final Fantasy's world to life. By later game standards, Final Fantasy I's soundtrack is short, with just 19 tracks, meaning certain pieces will be heard many times. But certain tracks, like the Chaos Shrine, still stand out even with the NES's more rudimentary sound limitations. In other ways, however, this is not the Final Fantasy later fans would come to expect. The story does involve 4 elemental crystals, which were localized as orbs, that the player is tasked with restoring, but there are no chocobos or moogles or summons, and much of the world and its inhabitants have more in common with Dungeons and Dragons than Final Fantasy, and feel slightly generic as a result. For example, the 3 friendly non-human races you can encounter are dwarves, elves, and dragons, while enemy encounters feature a lot of commonly seen Western fantasy foes, like goblins, ogres, skeletons, and vampires. One series tradition that is present is the player gaining an airship, which provides one of the game's best moments and most unique features. Before this, the player progresses through the overworld in a largely linear fashion, and while you do gain a normal ship and a canoe to aid with traversal before this, the airship allows you to travel the entire world at high speeds with no random encounters. The freedom this provides is liberating, and it's an exciting moment even today, let alone in 1987. Through various modes of transport, the player's adventure has them travelling the world to restore the 4 elemental orbs and defeat the 4 elemental fiends who are causing so many of the world's problems. And this tends to feel rather standard and a bit forgettable. Still, Final Fantasy does have one last surprise in store for the player that in many ways feels like a sign of what is to come from the series, as after restoring the orbs, the party must travel through time 2,000 years into the past to fight Chaos, the one who was responsible for sending the 4 fiends forward in time to the present. This involves a time loop paradox the player has to close, and involves you journeying into a floating sci-fi inspired fortress, and there's even a surprise twist over Chaos's true identity. And after such a rudimentary story in such a generic setting, this is a bold departure into unexpected territory, which shows that the storytelling ambitions of the series were alive and present even in its first entry. Defining what makes a Final Fantasy game is no easy task in a series that has changed so heavily, but one of the most essential factors seems to be a desire to go beyond traditional fantasy and what is normally expected, whether through setting, storytelling, or specific plot elements. This is a point I'll return to, but I think it's significant that even here, in this first game, which at times feels so much like a run-of-the-mill D&D clone, there is still something deeply Final Fantasy about its story and setting by the ending. And that is Final Fantasy I. It was a fantastic effort for its time, and it's still an enjoyable game to this day, if more as a result of its challenging and strategic gameplay than its somewhat shallow story. Final Fantasy I would be very successful, particularly in North America where it did much to establish the JRPG genre, and it wouldn't take long before Square and Sakaguchi would create a sequel. Before that, however, I think I need to at least address the issue of remakes and remasters. Almost every Final Fantasy game has been released multiple times, and there are often significant changes between versions, particularly in regards to difficulty and translation, two massively important factors. I have so much to go over in this video already that I'm only going to talk about different versions of these games when it seems really important. But it does have to be said that different versions of these games are different. When it comes to Final Fantasy I, for example, a new version was made for the WonderSwan Color in 2000, which was more of a complete remake than a port, and it was this version that would serve as the basis for almost every version released after. The changes this version made were huge, and go far beyond visuals, with more story scenes, a lower difficulty, and the addition of auto-targeting, and in later versions an MD system for spells and a new localization. In short, these completely changed the heart of the experience, and whether this is a change for the better is debatable and mostly down to individual preference, but it's important to understand that it is a change. Also, for every game in this video, I am talking about the original version exclusively, unless otherwise specified, and certain design elements that I will both criticize and praise can sometimes end up being changed in later versions of these games. So, moving on to Final Fantasy II, the Famicom version, that is. Final Fantasy I's success almost guaranteed a sequel, but rather than continuing the story or setting of the first game, as most series do, the team decided to create something entirely new instead, beginning Final Fantasy's most important tradition. For this second game, Sakaguchi wanted to place more emphasis on story, and many of its design decisions would be informed by this focus. And in December 1988, Final Fantasy II would be released, just 1 year after its predecessor. Still, unlike the first game, this time there would be no English or NES version, as the localization of the first game took so long that Square decided to skip ahead to focus on localizing Final Fantasy IV for the next generation Super Nintendo instead. As a result, Final Fantasy II wasn't released outside of Japan until it received a PlayStation 1 version in 2003, which is a very late time to be releasing a PS1 game. This meant its legacy and reputation in the West is rather different than the first game, but we'll get to that in time. Final Fantasy II begins once more with a familiar white-on-blue text crawl, but even from this first screen, there are signs that the story will be a little more interesting this time. You're told that the world has been plunged into war as the Empire of Palamecia seeks to conquer all with monsters summoned from hell. You are part of a resistance force that has recently fled from their home kingdom of Fynn, with the 4 main characters each having lost their parents to the war with the Empire. Then, after naming these 4 characters, the game begins with you on the run, being pursued by the Empire's Black Knights, who waste little time in cutting you down in battle. You then awaken in a nearby town after being rescued by the rebels, or at least 3 of you do, with the last being presumed to have not made it. From here, you try to join the rebels, who initially turn you down as a result of your youth and inexperience. Still, after discovering that one of the rebel generals has betrayed them and defected to the Empire, you join the resistance forces officially, and then spend the rest of the game assisting the war effort. This is one of Final Fantasy II's greatest improvements. In the first game, your objective of restoring the 4 orbs and defeating the 4 fiends felt generic and little more than an excuse to send you to different dungeons in different parts of the world. Meanwhile, in Final Fantasy II, what you do shapes the story, and often has a tangible impact on the world itself. One early objective has you travelling to the far north in search of mithril, which you ultimately find and bring back to the rebels. This then updates all of the rebel shops, allowing you to purchase powerful, albeit expensive, mithril weapons and armour. You also infiltrate enemy towns, sneak on board and sabotage a colossal enemy warship called the Dreadnought, try to enlist the aid of the Dragoons of Deist and the Sages of Mysidia, and storm the castle of Fynn to take back your kingdom, which leads to the rebel forces permanently changing position. Some of these objectives can be surprisingly creative and exciting, like when the rebel princess is captured and replaced with a fake, with the rescue effort taking you to a coliseum where you get caught and forced to fight in. Or how when you approach the Mysidian Tower, you find your ship is swallowed by the great sea beast Leviathan, leading to a dungeon inside Leviathan's stomach as you search for a way to escape. Still, the player isn't the only actor on this stage, and just as your actions sometimes change the world, so too does the Emperor's, as many of the towns you journey through will end up destroyed by the Empire in retaliation, killing most of the NPCs you meet in the process. In fact, a lot of people die in this game, from numerous party members to helpful allies to entire populations. Final Fantasy II's story is about war, and in it, war is bleak. It destroys and it corrupts. Through the course of the narrative, you must continually struggle, and everything comes at a cost. And then, even after your ultimate triumph, there's still no such thing as a happy ending for our party, as the scars left behind by these events are shown to remain. And there's a sense of thematic cohesion to all of this. This is a story about sacrifice and tragedy and the nature of war. Basically, that war is hell, and so it seems fitting that the game concludes with you having to descend into the depths of hell to defeat the one responsible for all this destruction all over again. And I think this is quite impressive. This game released in 1988, and I can't think of many other console games from that period that deal with subject matter like this anywhere near as effectively. Still, as impressive for its time as it might be, this story is notably brief, once more likely as a result of text limitations, and when it comes to characters in particular, it struggles to make a strong impression. For the first time, your party members have default names and in-game artwork to help bring them to life, but they don't have much by way of personality, and party dialogue is very rare. I mean, Guy does speak Beaver, and that is definitely better than nothing, but other than speaking to beavers and telling you he speaks to beavers, I don't remember Guy ever saying anything else. And while this is enough to make him more likable than some Final Fantasy characters, overall, characters, both NPCs and party members alike, still feel very lacking here compared to later entries. Nevertheless, compared to the first game, 2's story is a major step in the right direction, and this is not the only improvement this game makes. Presentation has seen numerous upgrades, from the more detailed towns that now have actual shop interiors, to the animation in the overworld with rippling water and flying overhead airships, or the improved combat screen that removes a lot of the borders and text boxes to create something much more visually appealing. NPCs can also move about during dialogue now, and there's lots of great new enemy sprites, although I do think it's a bit disappointing that the main character reuses the same warrior sprite from the first game, when this is arguably the most important sprite in both of these games, and even a simple color change could have done a lot to differentiate them. Alongside the visuals, Uematsu's soundtrack also feels improved, with a few really memorable tracks, like the hopeful and rousing Rebel Army theme, the somber Game Over theme that's also used during character deaths, and the series' best dungeon music yet in Castle Pandemonium. Final Fantasy II is also the first game to feature numerous series staples that help make the setting feel more like its own thing than a copy of Dungeons & Dragons. Amongst these are the main series mascot, Chocobos, the first helpful engineer named Sid, the spell Ultima, Dragoons and the name Highwind, and numerous classic enemies like Malboros, Bombs, Flans, Behemoths, Iron Giants, and more, which also bring some appreciated diversity to the gameplay in normal enemy encounters. And gameplay has also seen other upgrades. Final Fantasy II introduces the row system to combat, something that would go on to become a series staple. This allows you to position more vulnerable characters in the back row for a defensive boost at the cost of attack. But it also adds to the tactical side of combat, as enemies behind the first two rows are now untargetable by melee attacks, creating a new benefit to having access to magic or ranged weapons to focus fire back rows, while also increasing the element of risk and reward that comes with no auto-targeting, as it becomes more important than ever to not leave enemies alive in the front rows, as they will prevent you from targeting enemies behind them, potentially creating wasted turns. The inventory system is also much better this time around, as having limited spaces solves the time-consuming potion span problem of the first game, while having a shared inventory is far less restrictive when it comes to equipment. In 1, equipment was separate to normal items, and you only had enough spaces for equipment as could be equipped on each character, meaning to pick up new equipment later in the game, you had to destroy something you're already using first, and as you can't be sure what you're picking up, you either have to risk ending up with a downgrade or risk leaving behind new equipment, which is truly terrible design. By contrast, 2's system is much more functional and user-friendly, although the lack of stacking forces you to sell items continuously, and key items annoyingly take up one of your limited inventory slots permanently. Final Fantasy II also introduces an MP system for the first time, and allows you to save anywhere on the overworld without needing a specific item. Finally, one of 2's more underappreciated improvements might be its overworld. There is something appealing about the gradual linear progression you make in the first game, which ultimately culminates in finding the airship and gaining complete freedom. Yet this is something that becomes very standardized as the series goes on. Final Fantasy II's overworld, on the other hand, might arguably be described as a genuine open world, where most locations are accessible even very early on, and the only thing standing in the player's way are the numerous dangerous enemy encounters that surround these locations. This means you can skip ahead to many later locations, sometimes getting powerful equipment upgrades in the process, as long as you can survive the perilous journey to get to them. This general openness provides a much stronger sense of exploration, while the dangerous enemies make it feel more alive and exciting, and the less linear and more natural structure make it a bit more immersive and believable. It may lack the interesting late-game elements of games like Final Fantasy V, VI, or even the first game, but overall, it's definitely one of the most unique overworlds in the series, and makes me wish that this open structure was attempted again in the future. In other ways though, this is a similar game to its predecessor, as once more the main bulk of the experience is spent dungeon crawling, and once more, dungeons are large, punishing, and feature elaborate layouts that are difficult to get through in a single attempt. The difficulty curve is rather different this time, however, as while 1 starts hard and gets easier, 2 starts much easier, thanks in part to the more generous MP system and the magic of an early guest party member, but then gets progressively harder as dungeon length starts to increase, eventually extending far beyond anything seen in the first game, with the final dungeon featuring a total of 14 floors without any opportunity to save. And just as in the first game, status effects and ambushes can still be deadly, making actually completing Final Fantasy II a much more challenging and potentially frustrating endeavour than the previous game. By NES standards, the difficulty of Final Fantasy II doesn't seem that out of place, as this was an era where players didn't expect to easily complete every game they bought. By modern standards, however, Final Fantasy II can easily be seen as being overly punishing and unfair, even more so than the first game. To top things off, a complete overhaul of the progression system means grinding to get stronger is a lot less straightforward this time, and it's here we get to Final Fantasy II's most controversial feature. Unlike so many RPGs, Final Fantasy II doesn't have experience points, with advancement instead coming through skill use and what happens in battle, in a system a bit like the Elder Scrolls series. To understand this, it's best to divide this system into two parts: weapons and spells, and then stats. Weapons and spells are quite simple in that they increase with use. For example, the more you attack with a sword, the higher your sword skill becomes, and the more you cast individual spells, like fire, the higher level that individual spell becomes, making it more effective while also costing more MP. This works reasonably well and follows a believable set of logic, as people do tend to get better at something the more they practice it. That said, this can be very restrictive for magic users, as while spells you gain access to early on will level naturally through use over your playthrough, many spells won't be found until later, and yet these still start at level 1, making them completely ineffective until time is spent leveling them up, and that takes a long time. This forces players to either use only a very small selection of spells, which makes combat less interesting as you'll always rely on the same options, or to spend a long time grinding spell levels just to be able to use late game magic. And overall, this feels like a downgrade from the previous game's magic system. Still, the most controversial element of Final Fantasy II is how it handles stat advancement. Stats have a chance to increase after fights based on certain events that happen in combat. For example, physical attacks provide a chance to increase strength, whereas defensive stats increase through taking damage. As a result, many players try to manipulate this system to gain more stat increases, and this seems to often lead to people hating the game as a result of the slow and tedious gameplay this introduces. Some players might also be put off by the complexity of the system, or dislike feeling like they need to understand something so atypical. Luckily though, there is a secret solution that not many people know about, which is just play the game normally and everything should be fine. Really, the best way to understand Final Fantasy II's stat system is to think of it almost as an anti-grinding system. Enemies each have a hidden rank based on their difficulty, and the higher the enemy rank is compared to the party's perceived level, the more likely stat increases are. Also, the formulas which determine stat growth ensure that stat increases become more likely the more actions are repeated in a single encounter. This means long fights against difficult opponents provide much faster stat growth. Meanwhile, grinding against easy enemies does very little. In this way, the system is somewhat realistic, as it makes sense for characters to improve most by fighting challenging enemies. And as a result of this system, it means that the more you fall behind, the more you'll struggle in fights, and so the more your stats will increase. Whereas the more you grind or manipulate the system, the less natural stat increases you'll end up getting. Except it's actually even worse than this, because one of the main ways people try to grind in Final Fantasy II is by attacking themselves. This can lead to big HP increases very quickly. However, max HP isn't particularly useful, and in fact there are several important attacks in the late game which damage you for a percentage of your max health, making high HP bad as you'll take more damage and have a harder time healing yourself. Still, the real problem with attacking yourself is that it can never lead to stat increases for the most important stat in the game, evasion. And as you'll then spend less time in normal fights, you'll be attacked less overall, and your evasion will end up lower than average, making you more susceptible to the most dangerous attacks in the game. If all this sounds confusing, then it is, and clearly that in itself is the real problem. Final Fantasy II's progression system has plenty of rough edges, and pretty awful balance, but it fundamentally works, and the main reason people hate it so much is because they try to manipulate the system, often without truly understanding it, in a way that's often tedious and possibly not even helpful. There is a lesson here though, which is that complexity in games can be dangerous as it leads to player confusion, unintended manipulation, and resentment from people for being different to what they expect. Meanwhile, gaining experience points and leveling up works pretty well. Players get to make constant progress, level ups feel rewarding when they happen, and the familiarity of this system means players don't have to worry about understanding its intricacies, or anything really. You just kill enemies and get stronger, just as the Lord intended. And despite the fact that Final Fantasy II is not nearly as broken as some people try to make it out to be, its progression system also doesn't bring many advantages. It is open-ended, but rather than creating numerous unique character builds, you really only have a choice of characters being physical damage dealers, magic users, or some hybrid of the two. Also, while any character can learn any spell, the spell advancement system still discourages both variety and experimentation. And while there are lots of spells and weapons to choose from, some are just far better than others, as balance is still all over the place, with swords being by far the most useful weapon, shields being amazing compared to dual wielding, heavy armor being weaker than other armor, leveled instant death spells being far too strong, and other spells not even working. Much like Final Fantasy I. Still, while Final Fantasy II might not be some hidden masterpiece of RPG design, it does feel incredibly unlucky in just how harshly it's been received by fans. The reality was that unlike Final Fantasy I, there was no nostalgia to help win this game acclaim in the West. And after the meme of attacking yourself in combat to level up faster spread in the early 2000s, thousands and thousands of Final Fantasy fans simply played the game wrong and hated it as a result. And I guess you can't blame them. Still, with time, this negative appraisal seemed to grow, until the meme stopped being about the progression system and started being about the game itself, with people who hadn't even played this game still repeating and spreading this idea that it was the worst in the series, while rankings and game websites would always list it in last place, as it was the only game that you could put last without offending anyone. I guess what I'm saying here is that Final Fantasy II deserves better. Even if you do hate the progression system, this game still makes numerous improvements over its predecessor, with much improved presentation, a stronger soundtrack, improvements to combat, needed quality of life enhancements, and more. And as for its story, this is where the idea of Final Fantasy being a story-focused series began. And if Final Fantasy VII deserves so much credit for what it achieved by the standards of 1997, or Final Fantasy VI for the standards of 1994, or Final Fantasy IV for the standards of 1991, can people truly claim that Final Fantasy II doesn't deserve at least a little credit for what it achieved with its story as a game from 1988? But that's the thing with Final Fantasy I and II. Both stand apart from the rest of the series for their emphasis on dungeons and difficulty. Both are old games. Both have a lot of rough edges. Both rely on having access to the game manual to explain things. Both feature numerous bugs, poor balance, and overly punishing design. And yet, Final Fantasy I's problems always seem to be forgiven as a result of its age. And yet the same courtesy never seems to be given to 2. As if 1 is a game judged by the standards of 1987, whereas 2 is doomed to always be judged as a game that people first played in 2003. I guess I should admit, Final Fantasy II is my favourite of the NES trilogy, and to me the exaggerated hate is somewhat representative of the problem with Final Fantasy discourse overall. Still, as much as I like this game, I can't quite claim it is the best of the NES Final Fantasies. In Japan, Final Fantasy II sold more copies and received better reviews than the first game, ensuring a sequel was inevitable, and after a somewhat rocky development, Final Fantasy III released in April 1990 at the very end of the NES's life cycle. Just like Final Fantasy II before it, it would be many years before this game would see a release outside Japan, but unlike the previous games, Final Fantasy's third entry came on a larger 512KB cartridge, which was almost double the size of the last two games and would allow a number of visual upgrades, like an opening credit sequence. The first thing you see, however, is still the now familiar text scroll, which this time tells once more of a world of crystals recently hit by an earthquake, and 4 warriors of light who must stand against the coming darkness. In many ways, Final Fantasy III is a sequel to Final Fantasy I, not II. This can be seen in the similarities between its premise and setting, in the return to a class or job system, in certain gameplay elements like the use of limited spell charges and tiers rather than MP, in the more linear and vehicle-gated design of its overworld, and in its less serious story that is more of a whimsical fantasy adventure than the dour war epic of the last game. That said, Final Fantasy III does have some new features of its own, the biggest being undoubtedly auto-targeting. This means that you can order all characters to attack a single target, and if that target dies, the remaining party members will attack the next available enemy instead of skipping their turn. Auto-targeting is a massive quality of life improvement, and something expected by most JRPG players, and yet with this addition, combat is fundamentally changed from something where you have to think about what to do, even in normal enemy encounters, to something where you usually don't. Over the years, I have seen plenty of people say they dislike turn-based games and/or JRPGs because they're filled with easy encounters where all you do is spam the attack command without any semblance of strategy, making such encounters boring. For the Final Fantasy series, this game is where that criticism starts being true, as with auto-targeting, most normal encounters just come down to spamming attack, where this is not only a viable strategy, but often the optimal one, as it's better to focus your attacks on a single target to kill them quicker, and as long as you don't take so much damage you need to emergency heal in combat, it's also better to wait to heal until after combat's finished. This is of course a somewhat reductive description of Final Fantasy III's battles, just as it is for later Final Fantasy games, or other JRPGs or turn